Hey everybody, welcome to Always Bored, Never Boring. The other day I posted my review of Warhammer Quest Cursed City, and in that review I mentioned the house rule that I came up with to make the game a little bit more fun. So in my video today I'm going to talk about that house rule. I did say in my review that it was the only house rule I had to come up with, but it turns out that after I posted my review I discovered that I had actually been playing one of the movement rules incorrectly, which is always a bit annoying. It's annoying to put in hours and hours of gameplay, make up your notes, write your review, post your review, and then find out that you were playing something incorrectly. Fortunately, it wasn't a major rules issue, but it certainly would have had an impact on some of my games, particularly the deliverance missions. So before I talk about the house rule that I purposefully implemented, I'm going to briefly mention what I was playing incorrectly. The way that movement works in the game is that if at any point you move into a space adjacent to an enemy, you have to stop moving. For example, if Jelson here wanted to move past the rats over here, and he was moving 1, 2, 3, as soon as he entered this space here, he would have to stop moving. At this point he has options, and the most obvious option is to kill the rats. But maybe he doesn't want to do that, maybe he wants to carry on moving. If he wants to do that, he has to spend another movement dice, and then he can move again. This can be particularly challenging in the deliverance missions, where you are running away from an endless spell that is chasing you down the corridors and eating the board behind you. So what was the rule that I was playing incorrectly? Let's assume the following situation. Jelson and Dagnai are standing on the other side of this door, and there is a rat swarm next to them. As we have established, entering a space adjacent to rats will force you to stop. Furthermore, the rules say that although heroes are allowed to move through spaces containing other heroes, they are not allowed to stop on those spaces. So for all of my games, I played that in this particular situation, Glario was stuck. He would advance one space, but as soon as he entered this space here or this space here, he would be adjacent to the rats and he would be forced to stop, and as he is not allowed to stop on top of one of his friends, he would not be able to move there. That would mean he would be trapped in that room, and of course in the deliverance missions this can lead to situations where you're stuck, you can't progress, and you get caught by the endless spell. However, the rules state you only have to stop your movement if you enter an empty space adjacent to an adversary. What that means is he's in a position where he can continue through the door and move past the rats. He could step into Jelson Darroch's space, and because it's not an empty space, he doesn't have to stop. He can continue moving, and then he could move over here, and then over here. He has escaped the previous room. He wasn't trapped at all. I think it does possibly open up the movement a little bit too much. It allows for heroes to move more freely than they might otherwise be able to. But I guess this is going to be a personal preference thing, because each way of playing presents different considerations. If you play rules as written, then you have an extra layer of tactical nuance, because you can think about, okay, I'll move this hero next to this adversary so that when I activate the next hero, that hero will be able to sneak by without getting stuck in a combat that I don't want to fight. You can effectively create a path through adversaries by carefully positioning your heroes. That's something to think about, that is a strategy to think about. But if you play the game the way that I was playing it, you have a different set of tactical considerations. You have to think about making sure that you position your heroes so that they aren't blocking the doorways. For example, in this situation here, it would be very, very bad to leave Dagnai and Jelson in this position here, so you'd be forced to make a different type of decision. For example, if you only have one dice left for Jelson, do you risk killing the rats, knowing that if you fail, any heroes behind Jelson are going to be stuck? Or do you use your last dice to move Jelson out the way, which will free up the path for other heroes to come through, but leaves an adversary on the board? Each rule asks different questions of you as a player. Personally, I think having extra ways to restrict the movement of heroes makes the game a little bit tougher, and it's certainly made me think more carefully about how I'm going to position my heroes, and I have certainly enjoyed playing the game that way. I'm probably going to play a few games with the rules as written regarding movement before I make my final decision, but I've certainly enjoyed playing the way that I was playing up to this point. But now we've got that out of the way, let's talk about the house rule that I implemented regarding how enemies respawn. Here I've set up a very simple example to illustrate the issues that I have with how respawning works at the moment. You can see we have the initiative track set up with a single group of corpse rats, and then we have Dagnai and Jelson. In this first example, the corpse rats are going to activate first. Let's say they get an advance action. All of the corpse rats will bundle in. These rats will come around here, and they will all attack our heroes. With that done, it's time for our heroes to activate, and we will assume that between these two mighty warriors, they managed to slay all three groups of corpse rats. The dead corpse rats are stacked up on their adversary card. Good work, Jelson. Good work, Dagnai. Grab yourselves an inspiration point and a drink at the bar. We get to the end of the turn. A new turn starts, so we have to mix up the initiative track again. For the sake of simplicity, we will assume the order is the same again. First, we have to activate the rat group. We check to see if they've been driven off, and indeed they have been driven off because they are completely dead. So we remove their card from the initiative track, and we place a new one. That card is left face down, and that ends that group's activation for this turn. My heroes stand around waiting. We get to the end of the turn, we start a new turn, we mix up the initiative track. For simplicity's sake, we will assume it's the same order again. We get to group 1, we activate group 1, we flip this adversary card, like so, and look, it's Gorslav. When a new enemy appears on the board, it will spawn at the Lich Gate that is furthest from the heroes. We have two gates on the board, we have one here, and we have one over there. That means Gorslav appears over here. And the turn that enemies appear, they just do a basic advance action. That means they will make a standard move and then they will attack anything they are adjacent to. Gorslav has a movement of 3, leaving him there, and that's the end of his turn. And now I have two heroes who have been standing around for the last 2 turns waiting for something to do, so they are probably fully healed up, they have a full set of activation dice, and they can go to town beating Gorslav to death. That's one potential situation that can occur with the respawning the way it is. But there's also an additional problem in that the way that respawning works and the way that the driven off rule works, you don't always feel like you're under pressure to even deal with the enemies that are on the board. We're back in the situation where we have 3 rats to deal with. But let's assume that this time those rats are going to be activating later in the round. In this situation, Dagnai is going to activate first. We will assume he easily kills the 2 rat swarms that are adjacent to him. Having dealt with those 2 rat swarms, Dagnai doesn't need to concern himself with that final rat swarm, and neither does Jelson. We can now put all of our actions into moving, into running away. So let's run this away. Let's assume our dynamic duo moves up to there. We now activate the rat swarm. The first thing we have to do is check to see if the rat swarm is driven off. To check if a group is driven off, you count the number of active miniatures on the board, and if it is a third or fewer of the original number that was on the board, then they are driven off. In this case, we have 1 rat swarm left, which is 1/3 of the original 3 that were on the board. When a group is driven off, every active miniature from that group on the board makes a weapon action, and then you remove it from the board. Of course, the rats have no one around them anymore because our heroes used all their actions to run away, so our weapon action is wasted, and then the rat is removed, and then we replace that adversary group on the initiative track. When the new turn starts, we mix up the initiative track again. Let's assume that our adversary group gets to activate first. We flip the card over, and oh look, it's Gorslav. He will spawn at the farthest gate from the heroes. There he is. He will then advance, and that's the end of his turn. I'm probably labouring the point here. You're not under pressure to kill all of the enemies on the board. You just have to make sure that you're not standing adjacent to them at the point that they are marked as being driven off. And as long as you stay well away from one of the gates, you are always going to be spawning the enemies really, really far away. In all honesty, that's slightly less of a problem in this game because the enemies do move so quickly. but because their first action is always going to be a regular advance, you're not going to have those opportunities to roll on the behavior table and get a triple movement with your Ulfenkarn, or a charge move with your bats that allows them to move 10 spaces across the board. You're generally going to have plenty of time to prepare. It is clearly Groundhog Day, because Gelson and Dagnai are back facing these 3 rat swarms again. I'm now going to illustrate how my house rule for respawning works. We will assume that Dagnai is going to activate first, then Gelson, and then the rat swarm last. As in the previous example, Dagnai is going to kill the 2 rat swarms that are adjacent to him. And we're not going to worry about that final rat. We're going to use all of our activations to do other things. And let's say in our very simple example that our heroes end up here. We now get to the rat's activation. Normally, they are driven off at this point. In my house rule, I activate them as normal. So we will roll on the behavior table, and let's say we get a charge action for our rats. That allows our rats to chase after our heroes and maybe attack them. That finishes the turn, and we go into the event phase. Before we roll on the event table, we now check all of the groups on the board to see if any of them are driven off. As 2 of the rat swarms have been killed, the final rat swarm will now be driven off. And this is the first point where you can add an optional rule. Originally, I had it that, as per normal, when the adversaries are removed, they get to make a departing strike, a final weapon action. But I found that allowing them to activate normally, then allowing them to possibly have a weapon action at the end, was quite punishing, especially in the later levels, because I must stress that once you get to level 4 in this game, the game gets really, really tough. And if you are playing with this house rule that I'm going through now, you are really under pressure a lot. And the extra driven off attacks are probably a little bit much. You have to remember, once you get to level 4, and this did happen to me recently, you can have a Vargskar, Radukar, Torgilius, and Ulfenwatch all on the board at once. So you have the choice. Test it, see which you prefer. You can either give them the weapon action for being driven off as standard, or because they got to activate as normal in their turn, you can decide not to worry about that. I'm currently playing where they don't get to make that attack. We then immediately replace their card. We proceed with the event phase as normal, rolling for an event, and then we start a new turn, mixing up the initiative track again. Let's assume our enemy group is going to activate first. We flip the card. Who would have thought it? It's Gorslav. Now normally Gorslav would spawn over here, as far away as possible, but I do random spawning, where I allocate numbers to each of the gates on the board. You roll the quest dice, and that will tell you where your enemy will spawn. In this particular case, with the 2 gates, we will roll the dice, and on a 1 to 6, Gorslav would spawn here. On a 7 to 12, he would spawn over here. Because we're feeling mean, let's assume that we roll a 12. Gorslav spawns right next to our heroes, who thought they were being oh so clever running away. And this is the point where you have another decision, another way to ramp the difficulty to suit your particular tastes. The way I play is the enemy gets to make a standard advance action as per normal. In this case, Gorslav has spawned adjacent to our heroes, and we'll get to make just a regular attack against them. The other option is to roll for a behavior instead of taking that standard advance action. And that makes it much harder again. While it is quite fun in the low levels, level 0, level 1, it's quite fun to randomly determine where the enemies are going to turn up and then randomly generate a behavior for them. It's not so fun in the later levels. As I mentioned before, if you suddenly have Radukar or a Vargskar turn up on the gate that you're standing right next to, and then you get to make normal behavior rolls for them, it can be an absolute massacre. If you're finding it really, really easy at the low levels, it's something to consider, but I think you will find that as the game ramps up, it's not going to be necessary. I have tested this house rule all the way up to level 4, and at level 4, just having it that you make a standard activation with your groups, you check for driven off at the end, but you don't get that special driven off weapon action, you then randomize where the enemies appear, and then they make a standard advance action. That is incredibly tough, the pressure is there, you're constantly under threat, and I have found that there is no need for any other rules at that point. Phew! That was a lot to get through. Hopefully, this has not been incredibly boring. There's just one more thing that I wanted to mention before I ended this video, and that is, while I was preparing to write my review for the game, and while I was testing my house rule, I wanted to play the game at different levels that I hadn't actually reached in the campaign at that stage. So I came up with a very rough and ready way to level up my characters so that I could take on the challenges that I hadn't reached yet. And using this method, I was able to play at levels 1, 2, 3 and 4. It's by no means a perfect solution, but it is a way of quickly advancing your heroes in a way that at least feels a little bit fair and a little bit in keeping with how they would naturally progress through a campaign. And I thought some people might be interested to know how it worked. Basically, there are 3 ways in which your heroes can get stronger as they progress through the game. The first is by leveling up. Each hero has a specific trait which is tied to one of these trait cards, and on the trait cards you have 5 unique abilities. Each time your hero reaches a new level, you unlock a new ability. So if you want to take on a particular challenge like a level 4 boss, the first thing you have to do is just instantly unlock all those abilities on the trait cards. These aren't branching skill trees or anything like that, they're simple stackable upgrades. But there's some interesting stuff on these cards and some things that will make your characters much more powerful. The second way in which your characters can become more powerful is by using treasure cards. Treasures are found by searching objects of interest when you're on missions. And each hero is allowed 1 treasure card, except for the Caradhran Overlord Dagnai. Because treasures are single-use items and because heroes are only allowed 1 each normally, to simulate finding and using those items, I simply rolled the 2d12 action dice and counted up the pips. Each pip meant 1 treasure card drawn at random from the item deck, which I could then give to a hero of my choice. In this case, I found 2 treasures, but of course depending on the dice rolls, you could get between 0 and 4. The final way in which heroes can become more powerful is by purchasing empowerments for their weapons and armour. Each hero was allowed 1 empowerment on their weapon and 1 empowerment on their armour. And you purchase these empowerments with realm stones, which you find on scavenge hunts. When you go on a scavenge journey, it's possible to find up to 19 realm stones. And then at the end of the mission, you can spend those realm stones to purchase your empowerments. The interesting thing is, any realm stones that you don't use are then lost. So it isn't possible to save up your realm stones to make bigger purchases. You're always doing the best you can with what you manage to salvage. I thought the easiest way to simulate going on scavenge hunts and purchasing empowerments was rolling 3d6, with the total rolled being the amount of realm stone found on a single scavenge mission. Oh, that's a good roll, that's going to let me buy something good. And what I did was I made a roll like that for each level that I wanted to go through. So if I was taking on a level 4 quest and I wanted to scale my heroes up to level 4, I would roll the 3d6 4 times. And of course, because you aren't allowed to save realm stones between missions, you have to make those rolls 1 at a time, and each time you roll, you have to make purchases with the total you've rolled, then discard any leftover points, and then roll 3d6 again. And I thought that was a pretty decent rough and ready way to represent how you will gradually build up your empowerments through a full normal campaign. It's by no means perfect, but it enabled me to play the game at higher levels that I hadn't yet obtained, to test my house rules, and to get a better idea of what kind of challenge the late game could offer. But if you've been playing the campaign for a while and you do start to feel like it's a little bit grindy, you might want to do something like this just to speed things up a little bit. And with more time, you can probably refine this idea and come up with something a little bit more robust. That's everything I have to say for now. Thank you so much for listening. If you've enjoyed the video, please consider pressing the like button. If you really enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing if you don't already do so. And hopefully, I'll see you all again very soon. Bye bye everyone. Bye bye.